Hi, and welcome to video number 2 of my introduction to James Agee's book, Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. At the end of the first video, we were looking at the title of the book, and we saw that Let Us Now Praise Famous Men is a verse from Ecclesiasticus, which is one of the apocryphal books of Scripture. We saw also that in that chapter of Ecclesiasticus, there is a contrast, a dichotomy established between famous men and our fathers that begat us, between famous men and us, ordinary folks. And we ended the last video looking at a verse that talks about those which have no memorial, ordinary people. Well, what we see then is that Agee's title of the book is ironic. He's not writing about famous men. Right? He's writing about ordinary people, and in fact, very poor people. He's writing about tenant farmers, just the sort of people who are born, live, die, and pass away without memorial, except the tenant farmers have this as their memorial, this book. And so on one level, the title is ironic. Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. And it's a book that's not about famous men. On another level, he is celebrating the tenant farmers. He is in awe of them for a number of reasons. And he is abashed at the prospect of writing about them, of trying to convey their truth and their reality. It's his abashedness at this undertaking that characterizes the whole of the book, but that is particularly a strong theme in the opening of the book. And I think that this contributes to the frustration that so many readers have when they first approach Let Us Now Praise Famous Men. Why is Agee having such a hard time getting started? And why does he seem to be having such a difficult time saying what he has to say? Well, we're going to look at three aspects of the opening of the book. We're going to look at the preface. The preface is followed by two epigraphs, one by Shakespeare, one by Karl Marx. And then we have a preamble, a kind of second preface. There are more beginnings, false starts after that, but let's just look today at these three aspects of the beginning of the book. And perhaps by looking at it together, we can arrive at a place where new readers to the book feel more comfortable venturing out into it. We'll sort of get through the rocky bits in the beginning, which I think are wonderful. The preamble is one of my favorite passages, one of my favorite sections of the book. It's outrageous, it's provocative, it's gorgeously written. It is elevated in its aspirations and just a terrific piece of writing, I think. But let's look first at the preface. The preface follows, by the way, this well-drawn portrait of James Agee in 1936, written by Walker Evans. In 1936, Agee was 27 years old, and on assignment from Fortune magazine, as we saw in the first video. And he comes back to New York with reams of notes for his magazine article that he's supposed to be writing. And of course, he doesn't ever produce that article. Instead, he produces this 500-page monster of a book, fortunately for us. In the preface, he says a couple of things that I'd like us to look at. So if you've got your copy of the book, mine came in the mail. If you've got your copy of the book, you can open it up to the preface, turn a page, and he says this interesting thing. He says, actually, the effort of this book, the effort is to recognize the stature of a portion of unimagined existence, and to contrive techniques proper to its recording, communication, analysis, and defense. Now, if you've read the first 20 pages of the book, you've come across the word defense and the word defenseless a number of times. This is a terribly important idea to Agee, the defenselessness of his subjects. Defenseless against what? We have a right to know. And we can speculate what it is Agee thinks is attacking or is opposed to these tenant families, these farmers, these impoverished people. And we will, when we look at the epigraphs, we'll have more to say about that. But let's go back to this phrase, unimagined existence. Actually, the effort is to recognize the stature of a portion of unimagined existence. Well, if the defenselessness of the farmers was one aspect of their being that Agee is focused on, so is their not being imagined. They are real. They exist apart from Agee's perception of them and our reading about them. Agee is, in a sense, in an adolescent way, I want to say, but it's a kind of wonder that strikes one in adolescence, but that hopefully doesn't leave one with adolescence. Agee is thinking hard about this wonderment this fact of the reality of people and of things, the almost incomprehensible fact of existence itself. Now, you have to get into a certain mindset to enjoy this writing and to flow with the book over these hundreds of pages. And part of getting into that mindset is accepting that there is something marvelous, something ineffable, something inexplicable about existence itself. When we look at the preamble, we'll see some more of his writing on this subject. So we have the defenselessness of the farmers. We have their existence itself as a portion of unimagined reality, unimagined existence. And what he wants to do is record it, communicate it, analyze it, and defend it. And he finishes this paragraph by saying, more essentially, this is an independent inquiry into certain normal predicaments of human divinity. Well, he's going pretty far there. Human divinity. It's an oxymoron. The divine is not human, and the human is not divine, and those two terms have been separate and mutually exclusive down through history. But he is writing about what he calls human divinity. He's creating something. He's creating gods of these ordinary people. What makes them gods? What makes them divine? He talks about the photographs, and it's worth looking at this because we shouldn't overlook Walker Evans' amazing photos. And he says that the photographs are not illustrative. The photographs are not captions. The writing is not a caption for the photograph. The photograph is not an illustration of the writing. They are rather co-equal, he says, and mutually independent. And so some sort of synergy, we might say, is to take place between the photographs and the text, but we are not to subordinate one to the other, it seems, is what he's saying. And the last paragraph of the preface I'd like to look at. He says this, outrageous as it is. This is a book only by necessity. More seriously, it is an effort in human actuality. It's an effort. He's trying to accomplish something. And what he's trying to accomplish has something to do with human actuality, in which the reader is no less centrally involved than the authors, and those of whom they tell. Those who wish actively to participate in the subject in whatever degree of understanding, friendship, or hostility are invited to address the authors in care of the publishers. In material that is used privately or publicly, names will be withheld on request. He has a sense of humor. But the seriousness of this paragraph is that he's challenging the reader. He does not court the reader's favor in the book, certainly not in these opening sections of the book. Rather, he is rather barbed when he talks to and about the reader. And he doesn't believe, or he makes it seem as if he doesn't believe, that the reader is up to the task. Can we, who are picking up this as casually as if it were a book, he says, can we appreciate the gravity of what he is undertaking? Can we appreciate something called human divinity? Well, you don't have to buy into that 100% in order to enjoy this book. It is an extreme kind of absolute position that Agee takes up when he writes this book, when he writes these introductory passages. And we don't have to follow him all the way to that extreme. We don't have to follow him to the point of saying, yes, this is human divinity. We can appreciate, I think, what he's constructing, the idea that he has, without 100% buying into it ourselves. But this is just a matter of reading anything. I hesitate to be condescending here by talking about reading itself, but why not? We're talking about reading here, and I'm sharing this video because I'm sharing my thoughts, and one of my thoughts about reading is that when we're younger, we think, and we're encouraged to think, of reading as a kind of consumption, like food. We take it into ourselves and we become what we read. Therefore, we have to be careful about what we read. We don't want to read anything that says something we wouldn't want to fully subscribe to, because that would adulterate us. That would turn us into a wrong avenue. And this is how books get banned. The mature way of reading is to read anything and everything, and to hold yourself separate from it. To recognize that what I'm reading was produced by another person at another time. I'd like to know more about that person and more about that time. I'd like to know what produced this text, and therefore I can understand the text all the better. Understand the text, not consume the text as if it were food, and therefore have the text become me. You are what you eat. You're not what you read. Which isn't to say that what we read doesn't become a part of us, in a sense. But it's not a matter of religion. We don't read everything as if it were scripture. We can't. It's important to read things that you think are wrong, things that you think are perhaps even evil. Because the point isn't that we become what we read. The point is that we must understand what we read. And it's good to understand that with which we do not agree. It's good to understand that which we hold to be evil. You may not want to make a steady diet of such material, but you don't want to be afraid to read it either. And you certainly don't want somebody banning it and telling you you can't read it. In any event, digression over. If we turn the page from the preface, we see the two epigraphs. The first is from Shakespeare's King Lear, the tragedy of King Lear. King Lear is a play about an old man, a king who divides his kingdom among his daughters. He gives it to his two daughters, Goneril and Regan, and he withholds the portion he was going to give to his favorite daughter, Cordelia, for reasons you will see when you read that play. It is, for my money, as good a play as Shakespeare ever wrote, and this bit of poetry we have from King Lear, Agee chooses because it has a kind of immediate connection to the people he's writing about in the book. This is a section in the play when Lear comes across Edgar, who is a nobleman but is dressed up or dressed down as a sort of madman beggar, out naked in the storm, where the king now finds himself out in a storm rather than comfortably by the fire on a throne. He's been kicked out by his daughters. And here's the passage that Lear speaks when he finds Edgar, this naked madman, on the heath in the storm. Poor naked wretches, wheresoe'er you are, that bide the pelting of this pitiless storm, how shall your houseless heads and unfed sides, your looped and windowed raggedness, defend you from seasons such as these? Oh, I have taken too little care of this. Take physic, Pomp. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel, that thou mayest shake the superflux to them, and show the heavens more just. Rich people have pity on poor people and give to charity, is one way of understanding what Lear is saying there. Agee chooses this passage at the beginning of Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, I think, for this one particular line. Expose thyself to feel what wretches feel. I don't think he would want to call George Gudger or Fred Woods a wretch. But what he is saying is that there is something real and immediate to be experienced here in the lives of these other people, and he wants to experience it. He wants to feel the immediacy of their existence. That's one way of looking at it, anyway. But it's joined, that passage, with the concluding lines from Marx's and Engels' Communist Manifesto. Workers of the world, unite and fight. You have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to win. Now, he has a little footnote attached to that. And if you've read it, you know that the footnote is 5 times as long as the lines themselves. And he says essentially, these words are included here not to mean what the reader may think they mean, but rather what they say. That is a bit quizzical, but it's 1936, and probably more like 1940 when he's writing this footnote. And at the risk of this video becoming too long, we should acknowledge, if only briefly, the importance of the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the fact of the Soviet Union through the 20th century. Most of worthwhile American literature of the 20th century dealt with, directly or indirectly, as a main theme or marginally, but dealt with the idea of socialism, and behind that, the fact of the Soviet Union. In 1936, while Agee is in Hale County, Alabama, Stalin is beginning the first of his Moscow show trials. He'll hold these trials in 36, 37, and 38. You may have heard something about them. They were show trials, meaning they were not at all concerned with legality or justice. They were for national popular consumption. He was showing the country, this is what happens to people who cross me. And the result of the Moscow show trials was execution and banishment to the gulags, the prison camps in Siberia and other remote places in Russia. This aspect of the Soviet Union colored people's and Americans' idea of socialism and Marxism. Agee is very circumspect about quoting Marx here. And I think what he's getting at with his long footnote is that he's quoting Marx. He's not quoting Stalin. And he's not quoting American socialists like Max Eastman, and the list could go on and on, who were variously loyal to the American Communist Party, which was Stalinist, variously loyal to the American Communist Party, to Stalin, and then became most of the prominent American communists, in the literary world anyway, became anti-communists. And so Agee's quoting of the Communist Manifesto is quite an explosive choice because of all of the connotations that come with it. And it's those connotations he wants to dispense with. And he simply says, these words mean what they say. Workers of the world, unite and fight. You have nothing to lose but your chains and a world to win. And if we take Agee at his word here, he's being a socialist. He's saying, let's go back to Marx. There is something to it. And he's unapologetic about that. Okay. Then comes this poem. I said we'd talk about the preamble, and we will, but before the preamble comes a poem addressed to Walker Evans, and it's important. It's a part of the book that people skip over pretty commonly, but let's take a look at it. It is really indicative of Agee's self-perception as he undertakes this study, this engagement with these tenant farmers. He says, against time and the damages of the brain, sharpen and calibrate. Time and the damages of the brain, forgetting. Sharpen and calibrate, not yet in full, yet in some arbitrated part, order the facade of the listless summer. I'm going to start putting together this book. I'm going to start taking that experience of undefended and unimagined existence and arranging it into what he calls here a facade. Spies moving delicately among the enemy. The younger sons. Edgar was the younger son of Gloucester. The younger sons, the fools, set somewhat aside the dialects and the stained skins of feigned madness. Edgar was pretending to be mad. Ambiguously signal, baffle the eluded sentinel. He casts himself and Walker Evans as spies moving among the enemy. Well, the enemy is Fortune magazine and the U.S. government. Agee's working for Fortune. Evans is working for the U.S. government with the Farm Security Administration. Edgar, weeping for pity, to the shelf of that sick bluff, bring your blind father and describe a little. Behold him, part wakened, fallen among field flowers, shallow but undisclosed. Withdraw. Edgar has pretended to be Mad Tom, and he has taken his father, who has had his eyes gouged out by Lear's daughters. He's taken his blind father to the edge of a cliff. His father wants to jump off and end his life. And so Edgar allows him to fall. But he's not really at a cliff. He's just standing in a field. Gloucester falls. Edgar comes running up, pretending to be yet someone else, saying, "What a miracle. You fell from that great height, and yet you live. Not yet that naked hour when armed, disguise flung flat, squarely we challenge the fiend. Still, comrade, the running of beasts and the ruining heaven, still captive, the old wild king. So it's a poem that he writes to Evans that is full of allusion to King Lear. We needn't say any more about that, except that the enemy is, as I said, fortune and the U.S. government. But the enemy is much more diffuse than that. The enemy, in quotes, has to do with bad writing and bad reading and bad perception of reality, of other human beings. And there's a real kind of beautiful thread that Agee uses to intertwine the study of the tenant farmer families and King Lear and socialism. I spoke of this piece of work we were doing as curious. I had better amplify this. So begins the preamble. Well, the preamble is several pages long. We're not going to read much of it. But I do want to read to you this one paragraph, which if you've read it already, you'll remember this. For in the immediate world, everything is to be discerned for him who can discern it. And centrally and simply, without either dissection into science or digestion into art, but with the whole of consciousness, seeking to perceive it as it stands, so that the aspect of a street in sunlight can roar in the heart of itself as a symphony, perhaps as no symphony can. And all of consciousness is shifted from the imagined, the revisive, to the effort to perceive simply the cruel radiance of what is. Cruel radiance of what is. A central idea, a key phrase to this book. When Agee is in the Gudger's cabin while they're sleeping, when he's in a tool shed looking at the various junk in there, when he is looking at their clothes, when he is looking at their food, when he's looking at their work in the fields. This is, if he's looking right, according to him, this is the cruel radiance of what is. It's not imagined by him. It's not an act of the imagination. It's not revisive, he says. It's an interesting connection. The imagined and the revisive, to revise something. If I look at this mug, I can imagine things about it. But in doing that, I'm revising what it is. I am not accepting and discerning the cruel radiance of what is. Its actual existence. Well, here we get into philosophical matters. You are free, as you read this book, to pursue those matters to the extent you want. But we have to at least acknowledge that these philosophical matters are there, and that they're on Agee's mind, and that they are part of what this book is about. The thing in itself. How do we perceive the thing in itself without our dissection into science or digestion into art, without our imagining things about it, without our revising it? How do we perceive what's actually there, the thing itself? When Lear comes upon Edgar, and Agee knows this, when Lear comes upon Edgar on the heath, he says, this is the thing itself. Naked man. And finally, I'd like to read this part here. If I could do it, I'd do no writing here at all. It would be photographs. The rest would be fragments of cloth, bits of cotton, lumps of earth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors, plates of food and of excrement. Booksellers would consider it quite a novelty. Critics would murmur, yes, but is it art? And I could trust a majority of you to use it as you would a parlor game. A piece of the body torn out by the roots might be more to the point. As it is, though, I'll do what little I can in writing. Only it will be very little. I'm not capable of it. And if I were, you would not go near it at all, for if you did, you would hardly bear to live. Well, now, why would I hardly bear to live? The reality of the world he's in Alabama, these people, their existence makes it unbearable for me to live. There's something about existence itself that Agee wants to elevate to such a level that it overpowers and overwhelms the perceiver. You can buy it. You can say, that's nonsense. But that's what's going on here. And to recognize that that's what's going on helps in understanding this book. And I think we'll leave it there for today. We've looked at the title, we've looked at the preface, the epigraphs, and a little bit at the preamble. And we've gotten a sense for what some of the main themes, the main ideas and questions Agee's grappling with in this book. I hope that will have helped someone approach this book a little more openly, a little more successfully, perhaps. I think it is an absolutely wonderful book. Its sincerity is over the top. But for all its outrageousness, it does grapple in an intelligent way with real questions, real problems. If you watch the news on TV, you see one way of perceiving people. Is that the way that we want people to be perceived? Is that shallow and mercenary approach to human existence the one that we would choose? Agee sees these sorts of perceptions in his world in the 30s, and we see them now. And he's fighting against them. They are the enemy. And I think that this book is not just beautiful prose. For that reason, I think it is an important book. A book that'll get you thinking about matters that are meaningful and have consequences. So thank you for watching, and maybe we'll do some other books in the future.